Is Lewis Hamilton officially washed? Has Oscar Piastri shown again why he's going to win the championship this year? And why do the wet tyres in Formula One never actually get wet? This is the on-track recap. We're going to look back at both the Formula One at Spa this past weekend and also the final two rounds of the Formula E World Championship. If you're listening to this on talkSPORT 2 or on the talkSPORT Podcast Network, then continue. Everything will be put together. If you're watching this on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel, the talkSPORT's Formula E Roundup will be in a separate video, so you'll have to go looking for that. Because we start with Formula One. I am John Jackson. Piers, former British F3 driver and F2, F3, F1 Academy and many other things. Commentator is alongside me. You were working across the Spa races this past weekend, and it was pretty disruptive for the junior categories.
Yeah, you promoted me there. I've never actually commentated on F1 Academy, but who knows, maybe in the future. But yeah, no, I was on.
You had. How have I made that up?
Yeah, I think you just. I mean, hey, I'll take it. But no, this weekend I was commentating on FIA Formula 3 and Porsche Mobil 1 Super Cup. And yes, you're right, very much disrupted. F3 actually was the only one that was really disrupted. First practice on Friday morning didn't happen. Then it has got pushed back. So then quali was practice. And then on the Sunday, the feature race never happened. So that was a bit of a disappointment for the likes of Brad Benavides, who got his first pole position in the F3 and then wasn't able to use it. So yeah, tricky weekend. But actually, Formula One was disrupted, but then kind of wasn't. So I'm sure we'll get onto that.
Yeah, absolutely. A huge delay for the Grand Prix on the Sunday, where I think there were a lot of people who wanted to watch the Lionesses who were a little bit stressed because it was getting closer and closer to when the football would be on. There'd be an awful overlap. Let's then talk about, let's go from the start then. The sprint race. Are you a big fan of the sprint race weekends? I can't remember which side of the fence you sit on.
I love a sprint race weekend. The more racing, the better for me. This sprint race didn't exactly produce scintillating action, did it? Lap 1 was interesting, and then that was kind of it. But I think it's still better than 3 practice sessions. I mean, I understand that practice sessions are necessary, and for the teams, it's a bit of a headache. But I like the balance that we have in Formula One at the moment, where you've got these sprint race weekends, but it's a bit of a toll on the people working on them. I mean, I was at Formula One HQ, and all the TV production staff were saying that it's, really is quite hard work. And for the teams as well, there's a lot more pressure early on in the weekend and a lot more procedural things to go wrong. So everyone comes away from a sprint weekend pretty shattered. But I do think it's nice to have the additional racing. So yeah, still a fan, although this weekend wasn't a great advert.
I guess if you're a team and your driver makes a mess of the car, getting the car fixed for a sprint race is a lot more important than a free practice, because I guess you miss out on track time in a free practice, but you're not missing out on any points. Whereas if it's a sprint race, you kind of miss out on, then there'll be hell to pay if you don't get out there for that race, and there'll be no points on the board if you're likely to score points. We're going to talk about Lewis Hamilton in a little bit, about his qualifying woes, but also his redemption story as the weekend went on. But in terms of the sprint race and the actual Grand Prix itself, we kind of saw the same move being pulled by different drivers in different conditions that set the tone for the rest of the race. So it was Max Verstappen that pulled the move from second place. He was in the sprint race, he qualified behind Oscar Piastri, and it wasn't long before he was ahead. Can you talk us through the move that Max Verstappen pulled and why it's so powerful, the kind of Eau Rouge into Radion move that we saw this past weekend in both races, one by Oscar Piastri and one on Oscar Piastri?
Yeah, exactly. The sprint race was where Verstappen went through. It was dry in that condition, so actually probably more powerful in dry conditions because it's easily flat out through Eau Rouge and Radion, which used to be a corner for the drivers, but now in dry conditions, effectively, it's just a quite fun roller coaster straight. But it was a combination of factors. Max Verstappen got a good start, came out of turn number 1, perfect distance behind Oscar Piastri. If he was actually a bit closer, then he wouldn't have got such a slingshot effect. But with the long toe flat out, effectively a straight up Eau Rouge, then the massively long uphill straight that goes towards called Kemmel, that goes towards Les Combes, because the Red Bull had lower wing, there wasn't any DRS, didn't need it, and there's no one punching a hole ahead of Oscar. He could just drive straight past, and then we didn't see the reverse the lap after because that Red Bull was so quick in a straight line with the low downforce setting they went for. So ultimately, that was an example of really good team tactics and a game plan from Red Bull, because they thought that if we we can actually change the the drag of the car. So we're slower over a lap, but that will mean we're faster in a straight line. If we can get ahead, it will mean that we're almost unpassable. And that's just due to the way the track is. Spa, amazing track, deserves a place in the calendar. If it ever got removed, I think there'd be uproar, and rightly so. It's ingrained in the DNA of Formula One, but also it's really exhilarating for the drivers because it has so many medium and high speed corners. But as we know, medium and high speed corners, dirty air means that you can't follow too closely. And the reason that Kemmel in particular is where we see most of the moves is because you've got two low speed corners, the bus stop chicane and then La Source hairpin, where you can follow closer, and then you've got the long straight. Whereas you don't see so many moves into Blanchimont or the bus stop because you've just had the middle sector, which tends to pull the cars apart sort of 6, 7, 8 tenths. But then they can catch on the way to the bus stop in the toe. They can then catch down towards La Source, follow closely to La Source, and be in a perfect place to overtake.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the move that got Max Verstappen into the lead, I think they shared a video from F2. I think it was Alex Dunn. You know, and I'm sure as a driver, you love to see if drivers lift when they go through Eau Rouge. And I know this is F2 into Raidillon, and there was no lifting from Alex Dunn, one of the more aggressive drivers in F2. Are they lifting in F1?
In dry conditions, absolutely not. Easily flat out. But we heard in the damp conditions at the start of the race on intermediate tyres that it was, Oscar said, didn't he? He said, I was going to lift slightly less than Lando, no matter how much he lifted. And it worked for him in the eventual Grand Prix on Sunday. Because he mirrored the move that Max Verstappen pulled on him the day before. And that's something that these drivers do. They will have watched many, many races in the lead up to the race weekends to see how cars fall at the first corner. If they're starting on the outside in the mid-pack, for example, they'll know roughly where the pinch points are going to be. If they're at the front, they'll be wanting to know how far back they need to be going up Eau Rouge and Raidillon to be in a good position to overtake into Les Combes. As I said, if Max Verstappen or Oscar Piastri were too close going up Eau Rouge and Raidillon, you don't get the opportunity to get that slingshot effect, which takes you all the way past by the time you get to Les Combes.
So the big question is, given they were two very similar moves but in different circumstances, which one was more impressive? Look at the stats here. Obviously, Max Verstappen did it when it was drier. Oscar Piastri did it in wet conditions. However, Oscar Piastri had the benefit of watching Max Verstappen the day before, and he'd been very much involved in that move. So in theory, he had a bit more prep. What would you say is who was the most impressive? Because I wouldn't be able to do it, you know, on a game in perfect conditions with all the assists on, let alone, you know, obviously be anywhere near an F1 driver. But as a driver yourself, which condition? I mean, I'm sure the wet is infinitely harder, right?
Yeah, it's definitely Oscar Piastri's for 3 reasons, I think. The first reason was it was in damp conditions and they actually had to lift going through Eau Rouge and Raidillon, which means that he had to judge that perfectly. Second of all, it was a safety car restart, so he wasn't able to get quite as close going into La Source, or wasn't automatically going to be as close as going into La Source. And Oscar Piastri actually got that move. Sort of, he put himself in a position to get that move because his safety car restart before Blanchimont was actually absolutely spot on. Often we see the driver at the front able to gap 5, 6, 7 car lengths just by the reaction time of being able to make the decision, everyone else having to react. But Oscar was literally right under the rear wing of Lando Norris before the start-finish line, which is where, you know, the point at which from you can overtake. And then completely committed on a McLaren that has the third point, the same amount of wing as he did. They were running similar downforce levels, so the straight line speed was going to be comparable. So he had less margin for error. Max Verstappen was running a vastly lower downforce setting in the sprint race, so therefore had the advantage of a higher top speed anyway. So he had more margin for error in terms of the distance behind, how far, you know, the perfect slingshot behind he was going to be. So yeah, really, really impressive move. Granted, Oscar did see Max do it the day before, but it was in the drivers' minds anyway. It wasn't like it was a move that was unlocked once Verstappen did it. It's a regulation move that happens every year, but you still do have to time it perfectly. And very impressive from Oscar, and another example of why this year he's really taken a step forward and is able to take it to Lando. I think he's used all the experience of his previous 2 seasons and is just putting everything together and building race weekends, which is why we see him in the lead of the championship now by 16 points.
when we look at the sprint race, there's not a lot more to talk about. We will talk about Lewis Hamilton and his qualifying in a little while. But once Max Verstappen was in the lead of that race, he was fairly secure, wasn't he? Whereas in the Grand Prix, Lando Norris was there and thereabouts behind Oscar Piastri. But I think we saw that Oscar Piastri didn't really feature. There were no highlights of him making any kind of mistake. Whereas we kind of saw Lando pushing and pushing and pushing, and he was, he went wide a couple of times. He had a bit of an incident in the pit lane, didn't he? I mean, one of the tyres didn't go on, which wasn't his fault, which didn't help him at all. But again, when we see Oscar get a lead, we often don't see any mistakes from him. The margin for error is that on a par with Max Verstappen. I remember, obviously, a British Grand Prix, wasn't it, where Max made a mistake and we were shocked because Max Verstappen just doesn't make simple mistakes. And it feels like Oscar's along a similar line of focus once he is in the lead.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's another weekend where Oscar's basically gone almost mistake-free. I actually would argue that I think he made a slight mistake on his qualifying lap, a minor one, but it wasn't like it wasn't as big a mistakes as we've seen from Lando Norris over the season so far. And he also makes the right decisions in the right time. Think back to Canada. Norris had a chance to overtake Piastri and made an error in judgment, which meant that he was out of the race. And Oscar went on to continue after, Lando crashed into the back of him. We could easily have seen a repeat of that, and Oscar could have mistimed it, maybe misjudged how much Lando was going to lift in Eau Rouge, clattered into the back of him. We could have seen a double DNF. That would have been a big story in Formula One, but no, timed it to perfection and did everything he needed to do to win the race. And yeah, you mentioned Norris, even in the chase down at the end, making a few mistakes. Giving it to Norris, he was on the harder tyre, so was having to push harder to try and close the gap. So Oscar was managing tyres, and you've always got a bit more in reserve when you're managing tyres. You're not pushing them as hard. But still, we didn't see any mistakes like that from Oscar. And yeah, it's just going to show that at this stage, Oscar's just looking very much in control. And Lando's, it almost looks like he's absolutely on the edge all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can forgive him the one on the last lap because it's all or nothing there and he was pushing. And I mean, once he made that slight mistake, then it was just a case of Oscar just finish the lap and you've won the race. And of course, McLaren once again being quite dominant with Max obviously winning the sprint race for Red Bull. We've got the scene of where Oscar won his first ever race this time last year, Hungary coming up this weekend, and another track that you'd imagine he'd be very confident on.
No doubt. It's hard to call because as much as we've just spoken about Lando, the fact that he makes a lot of mistakes, every now and again, when he puts it all together, he's almost unbeatable. We've seen it in the past when he's at a circuit he likes, the car filling up to it, he's just absolutely on fire. And we could see that this weekend. And Norris has it in him. But as you mentioned, it's where Piastri managed to take the lead and take the win last year. A real step forward for Piastri. I think that was sort of the start of his current set of form. It's going to be really interesting. It's a much harder circuit to overtake at than this weekend. In fact, you almost couldn't get two more difficult non-street circuits. Of course, if you include Monaco and Singapore, very much different, but of proper race tracks. Spa, long circuit, long open corners, average speed is very high. And then you go to Budapest, which is low, medium speed corners, very high downforce, different surface. It's a different challenge for the teams and drivers. I think that actually some of the other teams might be a bit closer because the circuit is shorter, so therefore the margin for error is less. But I still expect McLaren to be up there. But it's also a circuit we know that Max Verstappen's been very strong at. I think it could even, if the Ferrari can get around things as well, they'll be close. Not sure about Mercedes. They're a bit weird at the moment, very unpredictable. Sometimes they're rapid and sometimes they're nowhere. So for this, it was a really difficult weekend for both Mercedes drivers.
Let's now then talk about Lewis Hamilton and his qualifying, because it was a shocker going out in Q1 for both of the sprint race and the Grand Prix. Didn't look good at all. I think the quote that I've seen from Lewis, and it's a one-word quote, is unacceptable. But he made up for it in the race. First of all, qualifying, what went wrong for Lewis? It was a case of one lap was deleted, wasn't it? I think that was for the Grand Prix. They kind of blend both into one another because they were so similar. But he shouldn't be going out of Q1 while his teammate Charles Leclerc is going right the way through. Yeah,
exactly. It's hard to, we've spoken about Lewis Hamilton a lot, and especially in recent times, it's hard to watch when someone like Lewis Hamilton, for those who are new to Formula One, Lewis Hamilton was known as like a qualifying demon. He was almost unbeatable, the fastest driver in Formula One for much of his Formula One career. '08 through till 2020, 2021, he was the man in terms of pace. But I think nature eventually comes round and your reaction's slow. As with every sportsman, you have an ascent to your peak of your career and then a gentle descent. And I think there's no doubt now that the descent is hitting or has hit. And, maybe his out and out speed and killer instinct in qualifying is the thing that's going. And again, it's hard to say because I'm a huge fan of Lewis Hamilton, have been for a long time. The way he goes about racing and what he's done is incredible. But you just didn't used to see mistakes like this. And I think it's compounded by the fact that he's joining a new team. He's with Ferrari. It's a power unit that he's never used before. And he's been open that he's still getting used to it. And that mistake in sprint qualifying where he locked the rears and just spun around on the entry of the bus stop chicane at the end of the lap, that's an error that you don't see from a Formula One driver, let alone a 7-time world champion. So there's clearly a combination of not gelling with the car and Hamilton, and then also Hamilton just not being able to get on top of things. And it's hard to see his interviews after sprint quali, the sprint race and qualifying. Again, hard watching. It genuinely dejected, genuinely upset. You can see he's troubles, trouble that he's almost losing motivation, losing self-belief to a certain extent, which is again hard to watch from someone who's been at the absolute height of the sport in previous seasons, and not even that long ago. But then there's still glimmer of amazing performance in there. The talent hasn't disappeared, that the skill hasn't disappeared, and I think that's potentially an area where, as you get older, that can decline less, is your decision making and the ability to build a race rather than one out and out qualifying. And he was about the only driver that was moving through and able to carve his way through the grid and make multiple moves. I mean, I think everyone else went up and down 1 or 2 positions, if that. Hamilton went from 16th on the grid to 6th up or 7th, and was making some really good moves, was able to make moves where other people weren't, into the bus stop and other places, one even into campus just before the start of the 3rd sector, which was really nice. And then to see him in the post-race interview actually energized, it gives us Lewis Hamilton fans hope that he can find something, and if he gels with the car, then maybe we can see a return to the form that we've got used to. But there's a lot of people saying that Lewis Hamilton's washed, and I don't think he's washed, but there's every now and again he looks like he's all wet and soapy. So hopefully he can keep the suds away just for a little longer, because I'd really like to see him get into maybe finish the season strong, feel energized, feel like things are going his way, and then who knows who's going to have the quickest car in 2026, because we've seen that Hamilton absolutely can take it to Charles Leclerc, who's at the peak of his career. Charles, 27, 28, 29 years old. 28, I think he is, isn't it, at the moment? And that's it's about the peak of his career.
I'm going to ask you the question. Do you think Lewis Hamilton, the realization is creeping in now with those 3 interviews after the sprint race, qualifying in the race, and the qualifying for the Grand Prix? Do you think there is realization creeping into him that maybe he's not going to be on top again? Because I think Lewis is very aware of his own abilities, but you can have all the ability in the world. But as you say, when you get a bit older, things do slow down and there's no margin for error in Formula One.
It's hard to say. Only Lewis will know that. I think he is still capable of taking it to Charles Leclerc, but we've spoken on this podcast before, and also, just chatting about motorsport in general when we're at the track. In Formula One, everyone's ceiling of performance is so high that almost anyone on their day is unbeatable. And I stand by that. Most of the drivers, I'd say probably 10 to 15 of the drivers in Formula One, if they're absolutely flying high and everyone's in the same car, they're going to win against anyone. Hamilton included in that, Leclerc included in that. But the difference between Hamilton of, let's say, 17, 18, 19, 20 and a Verstappen at the moment, or a Schumacher or a Senna when they're at their absolute peak, is not how high they can fly, but it's over a season, how low is their floor to performance? What's your average performance and the deviation? And we've seen over the last few years, Verstappen and just doesn't have a day off. He's always there or thereabouts, even when the car has no business being up there. Doesn't miss Q3, always there or thereabouts. Same with Hamilton when he was at Mercedes, the ridiculous winning streak, the fact that he went, 13, 14 seasons with a win in every single season. That's the difference. And I think his his ceiling performance is probably still there, but we're seeing more often that his performance can drop and he can have mistakes, and that's the difference. And who knows? Who knows whether if he gets the car in a position where he likes it, whether he can get the engine in a position where he likes it, if he can have a few consistent results back to back, and then maybe the car is then good enough for next year. Who knows whether he can take it to Leclerc? I think he could if everything runs his way. And also you've got Leclerc is also probably one of the best as well. So it's going to be hard to beat him even when Lewis is in his prime, and Lewis is no longer there. So I think, unfortunately, I don't know what Hamilton thinks, but the odds would be against him, I think, which is it's sad. It's hard for me to say even.
One positive thing I think that we've seen from Lewis this weekend, as well as that performance in the Grand Prix, is that he's felt the need to go and console and maybe coach and be the, not a father figure, but I guess an elder figure and a more experienced figure around Kimi Antonelli. After he had a shocker in qualifying, he started the sprint race from 20th. He was 18th on the grid for the Grand Prix as well. What do you make of the suggestion from a lot of sources that Toto might want to loan out Kimi Antonelli, if there is an option for him to get, a Max Verstappen in, to loan him to another team where there is a little less pressure?
There's a few things to unpack there, isn't there? I think Hamilton definitely sees himself as someone that wants to help the younger generation. I know he's shown a lot of support for Hadjar, who's doing well, who's been a fan of his. Great to see him giving encouragement to Kimi, as we saw. I don't know if you saw, but there was an interview where he genuinely looked like he'd been upset and looked like he'd been crying. And it's easy to forget that a lot of these young drivers, when they come into Formula One, they are late teenagers. And as much as they can perform on circuit, they're good in front of the media. I wasn't as resilient at 18 as I am now in my late 20s. I'm sure most people listening to this who are above the age of 25 are thinking, yeah, well, I'm definitely more resilient now than I was when I was 18. And there's the amount of pressure that's on these drivers, these young drivers, is ridiculous. And sometimes it gets them. And it's interesting to see the different dynamics of the drivers between them. On the Kimi being moved aside, I think we've said this on the podcast before. I don't understand why Kimi didn't go to Williams alongside Alex Albon, while Sainz went to Mercedes on a couple-year deal, because we saw that worked with George Russell. Build your confidence and experience and maturity in Williams, where there's less pressure and you can understand Formula One. Move into the big team, and Russell's been smashing it ever since he moved up to the main team. Kimi was thrust straight into Mercedes because I think Toto was worried about losing him. If Toto now moved Kimi aside, it would be a massive hit of Kimi's confidence. And remember, he is only 18. And even if it's explained to him that, it's for Max, it's for this, still, like, you've been moved into the main team and then you're pushed aside. What does that say? And I don't think Toto would want to do that, almost for his own pride. And also, completely aside, I still can't see Max and George as teammates. I can't, as much as I would pay so much money to see that, I think it would be excellent entertainment. I can't see it. I cannot see it. Surely they're not going to be put next to each other. I don't know. It would be great to see, though.
Only yesterday we had Tag Heuer Porsche in Formula E winning the team's championship for the very first time, with Pascal Wehrlein and Antonio Felix da Costa, two drivers who do not speak to each other. So it can be done. You can have animosity between your two drivers and still win a team's championship. So I don't know, but we run out of time. Piers, briefly, wet tyres. What's your gripe?
Wet tyres? We don't get to use them. What's the point in having them? I don't know. I don't know if this is the right analogy, but the wet tyres been like a bit of a third wheel at the moment, aren't they? They're just chilling there in the Pirelli trucks, and the Inters are getting some attention every now and again. The slicks are on every weekend, and then the wets are like, "Hey, it's raining. I'm right here." And then I understand, especially at Spa, the FIA's and the race director's decision to make sure that there's not too much standing water, because we've seen horrific incidents in wet conditions at Spa before. But have we seen the wet tyres actually being used? I don't understand why we can't maybe get rolling in the safety car a bit earlier, and they can mandate to the teams, you must run wet tyres. And then as soon as it's dry enough, we can go racing. And then the teams can then make the decision when to go onto Inters, rather than wait until it's pretty much dry, as we did in the sprint race. Like, it was pretty much from the start. It was like the Inters were getting destroyed, and it was not long before we went onto slicks. So yeah, wet tyres are redundant, or maybe we just get rid of wet tyres altogether and just have like all the formulas up to Formula One. You know, in Formula 4, Formula 3, Formula 2, you only have a wet and a slick. There is no inter. So maybe we go to that.
And there's got to be a solution. Maybe I would personally, as a non-racing driver, but as a racing fan, just say that the FIA say that it's mandatory that you use wet tyres, and we'll let you know when you can't. And then it's no argument, is it?
It would be interesting, actually, if they almost had a hybrid between a wet and a slick. So something slightly wetter looking than an inter, but slightly less deep cut and wet focused than a full wet. And then got rid of the normal inter and the wet, because then you would have more of a decision about when to go from the wet tyre to the slick tyre in a 2-tyre situation, because you couldn't run the inter like you can now in pretty much dry conditions until it's bald. If you had a more traditional wet tyre, it would then put a lot more tactics on the teams and the drivers, because there's a lot more risk in going to the slick. So it would be less of a foregone conclusion, which would then, I think, produce better racing, because the teams would be reluctant to go to the slick really early, or they would be reluctant to wear the wet out because it would be too slow. So I think that's a potential option that we could look at for the future, and potentially better for the environment, because all these teams in Pirelli are carrying all of these wet tyres to every single round, and they're never using them. And eventually they get, I don't know if it's every round, but eventually they get thrown in the bin and they never get used. And that's like, 3 or 4 sets per car per weekend that are never getting used, which are going where, and I think if we reduced it, it would be good on all fronts.
A huge irony that the wet tyres never actually get wet because they're never used. There we go. Tyres probably won't be used this weekend in Hungary. Of course, we'll have updates on the Hungarian Grand Prix on talkSPORT, and we'll have guests across talkSPORT shows, and we'll take a look back at it on next Tuesday's show here on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel and on talkSPORT 2 and the talkSPORT podcast feed on Track. Thank you very much, Piers. We'll catch up very soon. For those listening on talkSPORT 2 and the talkSPORT podcast network, next up, we're going to take a look back at the Formula E final weekend of the season, rounds 15 and 16 in London at the Excel Centre. And if you're watching this on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel, there'll be another video which you can watch, which will explain everything on the talkSPORT Driving YouTube channel.